Next chapter. The lymphatic system and immunity. The lymphatic system does some circulation. It has a set of vessels that collect fluids and solutes from the tissues, return them to the blood. Some of the vessels absorb fat from the digestive tract. We'll talk about that when we get to the digestive chapter. The big thing is that it protects the body from infection, and that's through a couple of organs, and mostly the cells, that circulate in the lymph and in the blood and can travel into other tissues. Tissue from the fluids, or fluid from the tissues, called interstitial fluid, is absorbed into lymphatic capillaries. So when some fluid is filtered out of the plasma, some is brought back in by osmosis, but not all of it. The extra builds up if it can't get into the lymph. Lymphatic capillaries merge into larger and larger vessels. The fluid is returned right up here in veins called subclavian. We'll learn about those in lab today. Lymph is mostly water with a similar solute concentration to plasma, salts and things like that, but without the proteins because those didn't leave the blood in the first place. Then it has some additional substances from the tissues, like cellular wastes, but not CO2 as much because the blood has special ways to carry that. Things that the cells secreted that didn't enter the blood, so they'll be carried back in the lymph to be put in the blood. And then pathogens that enter the tissues. And so this is part of where protecting us from infection comes in. Lymph is moved similarly to the blood in the veins, where muscle contraction and breathing push the blood or change the pressure to help it flow upward. Edema is when there's excess fluid remaining in the tissues, which is often from a blockage in the lymphatic vessels. So this shows there's a blockage on this one leg that's causing this fluid to build up, compared to the other leg that doesn't have edema. You can see how much fluid. Lymphatic tissue is kind of a specialized type of connective tissue that has a lot of lymphocytes in it and macrophages, so white blood cells of a sort. It's found in clusters in the walls of some other organs. We call that lymphatic nodules. In general, those nodules are called MALT, which stands for mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. So it's lymphatic nodules in the mucosa of some organ, like the airways, the throat, the intestines, and so on. There are some special areas of MALT. In the small intestine, part of it has nodules called Peyer's patches. And then your tonsils are the largest lymphatic nodules. They are clusters in your throat. What defines an organ of the lymphatic system is that it's separate from other organs rather than part of its wall. The organs are lymph nodes, the spleen, and the thymus. So on here, all of these green ovals are lymph nodes. The green stripes are the lymphatic vessels. Here's the spleen, and there's a little thymus above the heart. Lymph nodes are the smallest things that are truly considered organs. The largest ones are only about an inch across. This is what they look like. These little clusters are like lymphatic nodules connected together in the node. the lymph flows into it in one end and out the other end. As it flows through, the macrophages eat the pathogens, and the lymphocytes, especially a type called B lymphocytes that we'll get to coming up, they can meet the pathogens and learn what they're supposed to be fighting. So your lymph nodes are there to remove the pathogens from the lymph to keep them from getting into the blood where they can be delivered anywhere. So some major locations of lymph nodes, the ones you're probably most familiar with are in the neck and close to the ears. If you ever have, when you're sick, some kind of bump in your neck or along your jaw, that's a lymph node. Sometimes people call it swollen glands, but they're not glands. There's some in the armpit and around the breasts, cluster in the elbow and the groin, and then within the ventral cavity there are some, a lot surrounding the digestive tract for anything that might get absorbed from the food and so on. Questions on lymph nodes? The thymus is above the heart, and it's a place where your T lymphocytes, you've got two main types, T and B. The T lymphocytes move from bone marrow to the thymus where they mature. The thymus produces hormones that are part of that process, which is why it's also on the list of endocrine glands. Okay. The thymus is why they're called T lymphocytes. So that's all you really need to know about the thymus. The spleen, this is the primary lymphatic organ as far as, we can point to just one, where it is and what it does. I was really surprised to find a Garfield with spleen in it. I was searching for heart. So the spleen is kind of over here. It's got a little bit of protection from ribs. It's lateral and posterior to the stomach. In the spleen, there's repeating structures where there are some enlarged blood vessels called venous sinuses. The blood pools in there to make it stay in the spleen longer so that the lymphocytes and macrophages can go through it the way the ones in lymph nodes go through the lymph. Okay, so the spleen is kind of a second line of defense if any of the pathogens make it into the blood. Then there's two tissues in each of these clusters. The outer part, where the blood is more pooled, is called red pulp. And then the inner part is white pulp. The white pulp is mostly lymphocytes. The red pulp is more macrophages because they are also recycling red blood cells. We talked about the red blood cell life cycle a couple of chapters ago, how they get broken down in the liver and the spleen. Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did you change the slide?
Yes, I found out, if you printed it a while ago, I actually pared a bunch of stuff down because we've been tight on time, so I took some things out. If you printed it very recently, I made a couple of changes this morning because I discovered where some of the slides had pictures blocking words.
Okay.
So if you've got a slide there that we don't do, just cross it off.
Okay. There's nothing new you added or anything?
No, I only took things out.
Okay.
Or rearranged a little. So the spleen's function is to filter the blood the way lymph nodes filter lymph. And in addition to removing pathogens, it removes old red blood cells. And the two lymphatic cells do the same things, where macrophages eat damaged cells and pathogens. Lymphocytes get introduced to the pathogens, so they recognize what to fight. The rest of the chapter deals with how we fight infection. Pathogens are any kind of invader that can cause disease, usually small things. Bacteria and viruses are the major types of pathogens. Some fungi and things called protozoa can also be pathogens. Protozoa is a single-celled organism that has a nucleus like our cells do. An example of one that causes disease is malaria. Our defenses can be put into two categories, innate and adaptive. Your innate or non-specific defenses are always in place, and no matter what the pathogen is, they respond the same way. Your adaptive defenses are designed to target a specific pathogen, and they do their job better if they've seen it before. And so that's where we get the two terms for it. Specific because they're going after just this flu virus and not that one, and definitely not the chicken pox. And adaptive because they get better with practice.
It seems like the chicken pox is not really around anymore.
Because they developed a vaccine. Yeah, when I was a kid, everybody expected to get the chicken pox, and we worried about it if we didn't get it, because if you get it for the first time as an adult, you're more likely to get shingles, which is really painful.
Which one is more rare to get, the smallpox or the chicken pox?
Smallpox. They've actually completely eradicated smallpox except for two samples, one in Moscow and one at the CDC in Georgia. And every once in a while, the debate comes up of, well, should we just destroy this last sample? And usually the decision is, if we do that, then we'll never have it again if it turns out there is still some out there. And so we hold on to it so that we can make more vaccines if we need to. Yeah, my dad had a smallpox vaccine. I never did because they'd stopped giving them by that point. And we'll talk about vaccines near the end of the chapter too. So your innate defenses, there's a specific set of them. You've got species resistance, mechanical barriers, inflammation, chemical barriers, NK cells, phagocytosis, and fever. Species resistance means that just because of what type of organism you are immune to some pathogens, but susceptible to others. And that happens because we have different body temperatures or different proteins in the body that make us more susceptible to a particular virus or other pathogen. Some examples, HIV is human immunodeficiency virus. It only affects humans. There are other varieties like feline immunodeficiency virus. That one only affects cats. Another one is, how many dog lovers we have? Have you heard of parvovirus?
Yes.
That's one that's really nasty and potentially deadly to dogs. Humans, I think, can get it, but it's basically just like having a cold. It's nothing serious. So we have species resistance to parvovirus.
Isn't there another, I don't know if it's only for dogs, but there's a virus that I've heard of that I think animals get. It's called cordyceps.
Cordyceps is a fungus.
Oh.
I've heard of it mostly affecting insects, but each one has a specific type of insect that it can infect. Like this one goes for this type of ant, and this one goes for this type of beetle. So it's a similar feature. I don't know if there's a mammal version of cordyceps, or if there might be another fungus that can attack mammals. Mechanical barriers are our first line of defense against things that can affect our species. Mechanical barrier basically means it's a physical wall. And that's our skin on the outside and mucous membranes on the inside. These walls keep the pathogens from getting inside. The rest of the innate defenses we call the second line of defense. And then the adaptive defenses are going to be the third line of defense. What the mechanical barriers do is they have cells that are tightly packed together, so there's not a lot of room for the bacteria to squeeze through and get inside you. Some have fluids that trap the pathogens or wash them away, like sweat or mucus on the inside. And then in some locations, there's hair or cilia that can trap the microorganisms. If you've ever seen lint on your cat or dog's fur, the hair is trapping it further out, keeping it from getting to the skin, and it would do the same thing to bacteria. So this illustrates the skin as a mechanical barrier. Sebaceous glands, those are the ones that make our oils, if you forgot. Those, along with the sweat, can keep the microorganisms from getting up against your skin. Hairs all over can keep them from getting to the skin. And then the close-packed nature of the skin cells itself keep them from